When Amanda first met Victor, she thought she'd found the man who saw her for who she truly was. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and one decision can change everything. What happens when betrayal drives someone to rise above or seek revenge? Stay tuned for this gripping story. The flashes of cameras and murmurs of reporters filled the grand ballroom of the Hilton Hotel. Amanda sat at the table, her hands clasped together tightly, a single bead of sweat trailing down her temple. The whispers were louder than the formal questions. Words like affair, CEO scandal, and betrayal carried through the room. She avoided looking directly at the crowd, her perfectly rehearsed image beginning to crack. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to be her life. But this isn't where the story begins. Just 6 months earlier, Amanda's life was one of quiet stability. Married for 10 years to Mark, a self-made software developer with a small but promising company, they had what most would call a good life. Their suburban home, filled with warmth and laughter, seemed like the picture of marital harmony. But behind closed doors, Amanda felt something missing, a gnawing void that Mark couldn't seem to fill. Mark was kind, loving, and loyal, but predictable, safe. Every morning, he'd brew the same dark roast coffee, kiss her on the forehead, and head into his home office to code for hours. He talked endlessly about his projects and plans, but to Amanda, they felt small and contained. Her own life as a charity organizer, while fulfilling on paper, often felt overshadowed by Mark's tunnel vision for his work. She'd spent years trying to convince herself that stability was all she needed, but she wasn't so sure anymore. Things changed the day Amanda met Victor at a high-profile gala for one of her charity events. Victor Kingsley, the billionaire CEO of Zenith Industries, exuded an aura of power and control. He wasn't just handsome, he was magnetic, commanding attention with every word and movement. His reputation preceded him, an innovator, a ruthless businessman, and a man who always got what he wanted. Amanda had seen him from afar before, on magazine covers and in televised interviews, but meeting him in person felt different. When he introduced himself, his handshake lingered just a moment longer than necessary, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Amanda," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate, "your work for this charity is incredible. I'd love to hear more about what inspires you." She flushed under his gaze. "It's the people we help," she replied, her voice steady but her heartbeat unsteady. "Giving them hope, opportunities, that's what drives me." Victor tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. A woman with passion, rare these days. Their conversation flowed effortlessly. He asked thoughtful questions about her work, her ideas, her vision for the future. He listened intently, something she hadn't felt from Mark in years. By the end of the evening, Amanda felt seen, in a way she hadn't in a long time. When she returned home that night, Mark was in his usual spot on the couch, a laptop perched on his knees. He barely looked up as she entered. "How was the gala?" he asked, his tone casual. "Good," she replied, setting her clutch on the counter. "Victor Kingsley was there." Mark's attention snapped to her. "Kingsley? Zenith CEO? What was he doing there?" "It's a sponsor," Amanda said, shrugging. "We spoke for a while. He seems impressive." Mark frowned. "Be careful with guys like him. He's not exactly known for his ethics." His words lingered with Amanda, but not in the way he intended. That night, as she lay in bed next to Mark's sleeping form, she found herself replaying her conversation with Victor, the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel alive, important. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more frequently. Victor made donations to her charity and invited her to private meetings to discuss future collaborations. Each time, Amanda told herself it was professional, that the flutter in her chest was just excitement over the good they could accomplish together. But deep down, she knew it was more. It wasn't just his charm or his success. It was the way he challenged her. He pushed her to think bigger, to want more. "You're wasting your potential," Victor told her during one of their meetings. They were sitting in his sleek corner office, the city's skyline stretching out behind him. "You've got vision, Amanda. Don't let anyone hold you back." Amanda looked away, the weight of his words pressing on her. She thought of Mark, of his small but steady ambitions, of the life they'd built together. It wasn't bad, she told herself. It was enough. Or was it? One evening, Victor invited her to a private dinner under the guise of discussing a major initiative for her charity. The restaurant was one of the most exclusive in the city, its dimly lit ambiance and intimate booths creating a sense of privacy. Amanda arrived dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, her heart pounding as she approached Victor's table. "You look stunning," he said as he stood to greet her, his eyes lingering on hers a moment too long. Throughout the evening, Victor was his usual charismatic self, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper. He spoke not just about business, but about life, ambition, and the pursuit of happiness. He painted a picture of a world where Amanda could be more than what she was now, where she could escape the confines of her predictable life. As the evening wore on, Amanda found herself drawn to him in a way she couldn't deny. When Victor reached across the table and took her hand, she didn't pull away. The electricity between them was palpable, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "You deserve more, Amanda," he said softly, "more than what you have now." His words echoed in her mind as she drove home that night. Mark was already asleep when she slipped into bed, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't suppress. She told herself it was just a harmless connection, that she was strong enough to resist whatever this was. But deep down, she knew something had already changed. Amanda didn't realize it yet, but she was standing at the edge of a precipice, about to take a step she could never undo. The life she knew was about to unravel, and nothing would ever be the same. Amanda's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the glow of the screen lighting up the dim room. She hesitated, knowing who it was before even picking it up. Victor. Again. She'd told herself to stop answering, to stop seeing him, to put an end to whatever this was, yet here she was, heart racing as she swiped to unlock the message. "Victor, need to see you. It's urgent. Come to the suite." Her pulse quickened, and before she could stop herself, her fingers were already typing a reply. "Amanda, I can't, it's too risky." Victor's response came immediately, as if he were waiting, knowing she wouldn't say no. "Victor, please, just one last time." She stared at the screen, her mind a battlefield of rationality and desire. She'd promised herself that last week had been the end of it. That night had spiraled too far. Stolen moments in a penthouse suite, whispers that felt like confessions, and a kiss that had escalated into something she couldn't take back. Mark's voice echoed in her mind, his casual, loving questions about her day, his trust in her. But it wasn't enough to still the ache Victor had ignited within her. Against her better judgment, Amanda grabbed her coat and keys, slipping into the night like a shadow. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Amanda stepped into Victor's private suite. He was waiting for her, dressed casually for once, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. The sight of him, so effortlessly commanding, sent a ripple through her. He didn't speak as she entered, just crossed the room in a few strides and pulled her into a kiss. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and for a moment she let herself get lost in it. But then reality clawed its way back into her mind, and she pulled away, breathless. "Victor, we can't keep doing this," she said, her voice trembling. "It's wrong." Victor cupped her face in his hands, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Do you really believe that?" he asked softly. "Or are you just afraid?" Amanda hesitated. Was it fear or guilt? She didn't know anymore. All she knew was that every moment with him felt like a rebellion against the life she'd settled for, a life she was no longer sure she wanted. Before she could answer, Victor's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at it, his expression darkening. "It's the board," he said, running a hand through his hair. "There's a leak about our merger. Someone's feeding information to the press." Amanda frowned. "You think it's Mark?" Victor shook his head. "I don't know, but it's messy, Amanda. And if this," he gestured between them, "gets out, it won't just be messy, it'll be catastrophic." Her stomach twisted. She hadn't thought about the wider implications of their affair, how it could ripple out and destroy not just her marriage, but her entire world. She looked at Victor, suddenly unsure of everything. "Maybe this isn't worth it," she whispered. "Maybe we've gone too far." Victor stepped closer, his voice firm. "You're worth it. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The scandal broke 2 days later. Amanda woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Groggy, she reached for it, her heart sinking when she saw the notifications. Her name and Victor's were plastered across every news outlet, accompanied by grainy photos of them leaving his suite together. The headlines were brutal. "CEO's secret affair rocks corporate merger," and "Betrayed husband caught in love triangle." Amanda's breath hitched as she scrolled through the articles, her worst fears realized. The photos weren't just candid, they were damning. One even captured Victor's hand on her waist as they entered the elevator. Panic surged through her. How had they been caught? Who had taken these photos? And most importantly, what was she supposed to do now? Mark's voice startled her. "Amanda," he said, standing in the doorway of their bedroom. He held up his phone, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Care to explain this?" Her heart dropped. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. How could she explain? How could she justify the unjustifiable? Mark stepped closer, his voice low but laced with venom. "I defended you, Amanda. When people said you were distracted, when they whispered behind my back, I defended you. And this is how you repay me?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Mark, I'm so sorry. Don't," he snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare stand there and say you're sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this." He turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Amanda sank onto the bed, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her world was crumbling around her, and she had no one to blame but herself. The fallout was swift and brutal. The media frenzy was relentless, with reporters camped outside their house and paparazzi hounding her every move. Victor, ever the strategist, issued a carefully crafted statement distancing himself from Amanda, framing their relationship as a misunderstanding that had been misconstrued by the media. It was a knife to her heart, but she couldn't say she was surprised. Victor was protecting himself, just as she should have. Mark, meanwhile, threw himself into his work. He moved into his office temporarily, leaving Amanda alone in their once warm and loving home. She tried to reach out to him, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but he wouldn't take her calls. The few times they spoke, his words were cold and clipped, a far cry from the man who had once adored her. The final blow came when Amanda saw the headline, "Rising Star Startup Poised to Rival Zenith Industries." Mark's company was gaining traction, and the media was spinning him as the underdog hero, the betrayed husband who turned his pain into success. Amanda watched his interviews with a mix of pride and heartbreak, knowing she'd lost him for good. One evening, weeks after the scandal broke, Amanda found herself outside Mark's office. She hesitated, unsure if she had the right to be there, but then steeled herself and went inside. Mark was at his desk, his focus unwavering until he looked up and saw her. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone as sharp as a blade. "I needed to see you," she said, her voice trembling. "To apologize, to explain." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Explain? You think there's anything you can say that I don't already know?" Amanda swallowed hard. "I made a mistake, Mark. A terrible mistake. but I never stopped loving you." He laughed bitterly. "You have a funny way of showing it." Tears streamed down her face. "I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, just hear me out." Mark stood, his expression unreadable. "I spent years building a life with you, Amanda, trusting you, believing in you, and you threw it all away for what? A man who tossed you aside the moment things got tough?" "I know," she whispered. "I was wrong, I was selfish, but I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make things right." Mark stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "You can't. What's done is done." Amanda felt her heart shatter all over again as he walked past her, his words echoing in her mind. What's done is done. She'd lost him, not because of Victor or the scandal, but because of her own choices. As she left his office that night, she realized the full weight of what she'd done. There were no more excuses, no more justifications. She'd crossed a line she could never uncross, and now she had to live with the consequences. Amanda sat alone in the darkened living room of their once happy home. The house was eerily quiet, its warmth long gone. She clutched her phone, scrolling through the news articles about Mark's rising success. The headlines painted him as the resilient entrepreneur who had overcome betrayal, while she had become nothing more than a footnote in his story. A scandalous mistake. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Her heart raced as she heard the familiar jingle of keys and the click of the front door opening. Mark was home. For the first time in weeks, he'd come back. She stood up, unsure of what to expect. Mark stepped inside, his presence commanding even in silence. His face was drawn, his eyes cold as they met hers. He closed the door behind him and set his briefcase down with deliberate care, his movements calculated. "We need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Amanda nodded, her throat dry. She gestured toward the couch, but he ignored the invitation, choosing to remain standing, his arms crossed. The distance between them felt insurmountable. "I'm listening," he said, his tone sharp and to the point. Amanda took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "Mark, Her voice cracked and she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't even know where to start." "How about with the truth?" he snapped. "Because I've had enough of lies." The venom in his voice cut through her like a knife, but she knew she deserved it. She forced herself to look up, meeting his icy stare. "The truth is, I made the biggest mistake of my life," she began, her voice shaking. "I let myself be swept up in something that I thought was missing from my life. But it wasn't real, Mark. None of it was real." Mark laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Not real? So what, it was just some fantasy? A little game to pass the time while I worked my ass off to build a life for us?" "No," Amanda said quickly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It wasn't like that. I was wrong, Mark. I was selfish and stupid. I let myself believe that I needed more, but the truth is, I had everything I needed with you. I just didn't see it." Mark's jaw tightened, his anger barely contained. "You didn't see it? That's your excuse? I gave you everything, Amanda. I loved you, I trusted you, and you threw it all away for what? A man who only saw you as a distraction?" His words stung, but Amanda knew he was right. She had no defense, no justification. All she had were regrets. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I hate myself for it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am." Mark's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of pain crossing his face before the mask of anger returned. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't erase the humiliation, the betrayal, or the fact that I had to find out from a news article that my wife was sleeping with the CEO of my rival company." Amanda winced, her guilt overwhelming. "I wish I could take it all back," she said, her voice breaking. I wish I could undo everything and go back to the way things were. Mark shook his head, his eyes filled with disappointment. You can't, he said firmly, and neither can I. The weight of his words settled over her, suffocating and final. Amanda felt the walls closing in, her heart breaking all over again. I still love you, Mark, she said desperately. I know I don't deserve you, but I do. I love you. Mark stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might soften, that there might be a glimmer of hope. But then he spoke, his voice cold and resolute. Love isn't enough, Amanda. Not anymore. His words were like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless. She sank onto the couch, tears streaming down her face as the reality of their situation sank in. Mark stepped closer, his tone shifting from anger to a quiet, almost mournful determination. I spent years building a life with you, Amanda. I trusted you with everything I had, and you broke that trust. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed us. I didn't mean to, she whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, he said, his voice cracking. And now, I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again. The silence that followed was deafening, each second stretching into an eternity. Amanda wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the gap between them, but no words came. What could she say that wouldn't sound hollow or meaningless? Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm moving out, he said finally. For good. Amanda's heart stopped. Mark, please, she begged. Don't do this. We can fix this. We can try. Mark shook his head. No, Amanda, you don't get to decide that anymore. I've made my choice. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing only briefly to glance back at her. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but it's not with me. And with that, he was gone. Amanda sat frozen on the couch, the sound of the door closing echoing in her ears. She felt like a shell of herself, hollow and broken, everything she'd taken for granted. Mark's love, their life together, was gone, and it was all her fault. For hours she sat in silence, replaying their conversation over and over in her mind. She knew Mark was right. She'd destroyed their marriage, and there was no going back. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, Amanda realized that she was truly alone, and for the first time she understood the full weight of her choices. There was no escaping the consequences. The days after Mark's departure passed in a haze for Amanda. Each morning she woke up hoping it had all been a nightmare, only to be confronted by the emptiness of their home. His scent lingered on the pillow he used to sleep on. His coffee mug sat in the sink untouched, and the small comforts of his presence were now stark reminders of her loss. She spent hours scrolling through the endless headlines about the affair. The public had turned her into a villain. Social media was ablaze with cruel comments and memes about her betrayal. Even her charity work, the one thing she thought would remain intact, suffered. Major sponsors withdrew their support, unwilling to associate with the scandal. But the hardest part wasn't the public humiliation. It was the silence from Mark. She'd sent him countless texts, left voicemails pleading for a chance to explain, but he never responded. For years he had been the steady presence in her life, and now he was a ghost. Unreachable. One day, Amanda sat at her dining table, staring at the pile of mail she'd been ignoring. Among the bills and junk mail was an envelope from Mark's lawyer. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were divorce papers, crisp and emotionless. The finality of it was suffocating. She had lost him. Mark, on the other hand, was thriving. His small startup, which had once struggled for recognition, was now the talk of the tech world. Investors flocked to him, and his new product, a security software suite designed to rival Victor's, had become an industry disruptor. The media painted him as the epitome of resilience, a man who had turned heartbreak into success. But success didn't erase the pain. Late at night, when the buzz of work quieted and he found himself alone, Mark couldn't stop his mind from wandering back to Amanda. He hated that he still thought about her, that he missed her smile, her laugh, the way she used to hum while cooking. He wanted to forget her, to erase every trace of their time together. But the truth was, no amount of work or accolades could fill the void she had left. The love he'd once felt for her wasn't something he could just turn off. And yet, the betrayal was a wound too deep to heal. Weeks later, Amanda found herself at a coffee shop, staring at a laptop screen as she tried to update her resume. She hadn't worked in years, having dedicated herself fully to charity work and supporting Mark. But with her reputation tarnished and her marriage over, she needed to start over. The thought was, as she typed, a shadow fell across her table. Looking up, she saw Victor standing there, his trademark confidence radiating from him. For a moment, she was frozen, unsure how to react. This was the man who had set everything in motion, who had been her escape and her downfall. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice smooth. She hesitated before nodding. "Go ahead." Victor slid into the seat across from her, studying her with an unreadable expression. "You've been hard to reach," he said, as if they'd parted on amicable terms. "I've been busy," Amanda replied curtly. She didn't owe him an explanation. Victor leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes never leaving hers. "I wanted to see how you were holding up." Amanda let out a bitter laugh. "How I'm holding up? You mean after my marriage fell apart, my reputation was ruined, and I lost everything? I'm doing great, Victor. Thanks for asking." He winced at her sarcasm, but recovered quickly. "Look, I didn't want it to end like this. I care about you, Amanda." "No, you don't," she snapped. "You cared about what I represented, an escape, a thrill, and when things got tough, you distanced yourself to save your own skin." Victor opened his mouth to argue, but closed it again, knowing she was right. For all his charm and charisma, he couldn't deny that he had used her. And now, sitting across from her, he felt a pang of guilt he wasn't used to. "You're right," he admitted. "I was selfish. I handled things poorly. But I meant it when I said you deserved more." Amanda shook her head. "More? Victor, I had everything. I had a husband who loved me, a stable life, and I threw it all away because I let myself believe your lies. I don't blame you for everything, but I do blame you for making me think I was missing something." Victor looked genuinely remorseful, but it didn't matter. Amanda didn't need his apology. What she needed was to figure out how to rebuild her life, with or without his input. A week later, Amanda took the first step toward rebuilding. She met with a therapist, something she'd avoided for years. Sitting in that small, unassuming office, she finally began to unpack the choices that had led her to this point. She realized how much she had let external validation define her self-worth, how she had sought approval from everyone but herself. As the weeks turned into months, Amanda slowly started to piece herself back together. She found work with a local nonprofit, using her skills to help underprivileged women find jobs and housing. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was fulfilling in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, she wasn't chasing anyone else's idea of success. She was simply trying to be better. Meanwhile, Mark continued to flourish. His company's growth was meteoric, and he became a sought-after figure in the tech world. But despite his professional triumphs, there was a part of him that still felt incomplete. He told himself he'd moved on, that Amanda was just a chapter in his past. but his heart didn't fully believe it. One afternoon, as he sat in his office reviewing a proposal, he came across Amanda's name in an article. It was a profile piece about her work at the nonprofit, highlighting her efforts to help women rebuild their lives. The photo accompanying the article showed her smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile he hadn't seen in years. For the first time, Mark didn't feel anger or bitterness when he thought of her. Instead, he felt a pang of something else. Admiration. She was finding her way, just as he had. Months later, Amanda stood in the park where she and Mark had once spent lazy Sunday afternoons. The air was crisp, the leaves turning shades of amber and gold. She watched as families strolled by, their laughter filling the air. She didn't notice Mark standing a few feet away until he spoke. "Nice day, isn't it?" he said, his voice familiar but cautious. Amanda turned, startled. "Mark," she said, her heart skipping a beat. He smiled faintly, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I saw the article about your nonprofit. You're doing good work." "Thanks," she said, her voice soft. "And your company, you've done amazing things." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "I'm glad you're doing well," Mark said finally. "You deserve it." Amanda felt tears sting her eyes but blinked them away. "So do you." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Take care, Amanda." "You too, Mark." As he walked away, Amanda felt a strange sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she felt ready to face it. Alone, but stronger than before. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden hue over Amanda's small apartment. She sat by the window, sipping a cup of tea, watching the world outside move on. People walking their dogs, couples holding hands, and children laughing as they played on the sidewalk. For the first time in months, Amanda didn't feel consumed by shame or regret. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of clarity, a rare calm that had eluded her for so long. She thought back to the life she'd once had, a life that to everyone else had seemed perfect. A loving husband, a comfortable home, and a role in society that made her feel relevant. But beneath the surface, she had been restless. She'd convinced herself that Mark's steady love wasn't enough, that she needed excitement, passion, and validation from a world that had no stake in her happiness. And in chasing that fleeting sense of fulfillment, she'd lost everything. But as Amanda reflected on her journey, she realized something profound. Losing everything had forced her to find herself. Her work at the nonprofit had become more than just a job. It had become her lifeline. Every day, Amanda worked with women who were struggling to rebuild their lives after facing challenges far greater than her own. Some had escaped abusive relationships, others had battled addiction, and many had endured the kind of systemic neglect that left them feeling invisible. These women, with their quiet strength and unyielding resilience, inspired Amanda in ways she never expected. They reminded her that no matter how far someone falls, there's always a way back up. And in helping them, she was slowly healing herself. She recalled a woman named Carmen, who had come to the nonprofit after losing her home and custody of her children. Carmen had been shattered, a shell of herself, but Amanda had worked closely with her, guiding her through job applications, helping her secure housing, and supporting her through every small victory. Months later, Carmen had stood before a crowd at one of the nonprofit's events, sharing her story of triumph. Her words echoed in Amanda's mind. "I thought I was broken beyond repair, but I wasn't. I just needed someone to remind me that I was worth fixing." Those words stayed with Amanda. They reminded her that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing from it, and finding the strength to move forward. Amanda's thoughts drifted to Mark. She hadn't seen him since their brief encounter at the park months ago. That moment had been bittersweet, a reminder of all they had lost, but also a quiet acknowledgement that they were both on paths they needed to walk alone. In the beginning, she had clung to the hope of reconciliation, of somehow earning back his trust and rebuilding what they had. But over time, she realized that her desire to fix their marriage wasn't about Mark. It was about her inability to face the consequences of her actions. She wanted his forgiveness because she didn't know how to forgive herself. But that had changed. Through therapy, through her work, and through the simple act of sitting with her pain instead of running from it, Amanda had begun to understand herself in ways she never had before. She saw the patterns in her life, the need for external validation, the fear of being insignificant, the constant search for something more. She realized that she had placed an impossible burden on Mark, expecting him to fill the voids she hadn't been willing to confront within herself. That Mark hadn't been perfect. He had been consumed by his work, often oblivious to her growing dissatisfaction. But he had loved her deeply, and she had taken that love for granted. Losing him had been the wake-up call she needed, a painful but necessary lesson about the consequences of selfishness. Amanda didn't know if Mark would ever truly forgive her, and she was learning to be okay with that. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't something she could demand or expect from him. It was something she had to give to herself, piece by piece, day by day. Her thoughts turned to Victor. She hadn't seen or heard from him since their encounter at the coffee shop. Whatever fleeting remorse he had shown that day hadn't changed who he was. A man who thrived on power and control, who saw people as tools to be used and discarded. Amanda no longer blamed him for what had happened. He hadn't forced her into anything. The choices she had made were her own, and so were the consequences. But she did wonder, from time to time, if Victor ever thought about her, if he ever felt even a fraction of the guilt and regret she had carried. Probably not, she decided, and that was fine. Victor's opinion of her no longer mattered. The only opinion that mattered was her own. Amanda's phone buzzed on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from one of her colleagues at the nonprofit, reminding her about an upcoming event. She smiled as she typed a quick reply, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. As she set the phone down, her gaze fell on the divorce papers that still sat in a drawer, signed but not yet filed. She had been holding on to them, unsure if letting go of that final piece of her marriage meant letting go of Mark entirely. But now she realized it wasn't about letting go of him. It was about freeing herself. That evening, Amanda placed the papers in an envelope, addressed them to Mark's lawyer, and sealed it. It wasn't closure. It was acceptance. Months later, Amanda stood in front of a room full of people at the nonprofit's annual gala. She had been asked to speak, to share her own journey of loss and redemption. As she looked out at the audience, she saw faces filled with hope, resilience, and the quiet determination to rebuild. "My story isn't unique," she began, her voice steady. "I made mistakes, big ones. I hurt people I loved, and I lost things I thought I could never live without. But what I've learned is that even in our darkest moments, there's an opportunity to grow, to change, to be better." She paused, letting the words sink in. We all deserve a second chance. Not because we're perfect, but because we're willing to try. And that's what I see in this room, people who are trying, people who are choosing to believe in themselves, even when it feels impossible. The audience erupted into applause, and Amanda felt a swell of emotion. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the villain of her own story. She felt like someone who was learning, growing, and finally moving forward. As the night ended, Amanda stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The stars were scattered across the sky, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at peace. Her past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was Amanda, and she was enough. The morning was cool and quiet, the first rays of sunlight peeking through the trees lining the park. Amanda walked slowly along the path, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. The world felt still, peaceful in a way that mirrored her own heart. It had been 2 years since the scandal, 2 years of hard lessons and quiet rebuilding. Today was a day she'd been anticipating, a day she wasn't sure would ever come. At the end of the path, she saw Mark sitting on a bench, his silhouette familiar even after all this time. He looked up as she approached, a small, cautious smile on his face. Amanda felt her breath catch in her chest. He looked different. Older, perhaps, or maybe just wiser. But there was still kindness in his eyes, even if it was guarded. "Thanks for meeting me," Amanda said, sitting down beside him. Mark nodded. "I wasn't sure if I should, but I'm glad I did." They sat in silence for a moment, the soft rustling of leaves filling the space between them. Amanda had spent weeks thinking about what she wanted to say, rehearsing her words. But now, sitting here, she decided to speak from the heart. "I wanted to see you because I needed to say thank you," she began. "Not just for meeting me today, but for everything. For the years we had together, for the love you gave me, and even for the way you walked away. You didn't deserve what I did to you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But your strength, it forced me to find my own." Mark looked at her, his expression softening. "I didn't know if I'd ever be able to forgive you," he admitted. "But I've realized that holding on to anger wasn't helping me. It took time, but I've let it go. I've moved on." Amanda nodded, her heart aching but also relieved. She didn't expect forgiveness, but hearing those words from Mark was more than she could have hoped for. "I'm so glad you've found peace," she said sincerely. "You deserve it." Mark studied her for a moment. "You seem different, happier." "I am," Amanda said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It took a long time, but I finally figured out who I am. And for the first time, I like that person." Mark smiled back, a genuine, warm smile that reminded her of the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "I'm glad," he said. "Really." They sat together for a while longer, the weight of their past slowly fading into the background. When they finally stood to leave, Amanda felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. As she walked away, the morning sun warming her face, Amanda felt hopeful. Life hadn't turned out the way she'd expected, but it was hers now, and she was ready to embrace it.